The morning had started like every other for Margaret Maggie O'Hara. A patch of sun filtered through her lace curtains. The tea kettle began to whistle. Birds chirped politely from the old oak tree outside her kitchen window. And Maggie, wrapped in her thick wool cardigan, sat at her kitchen table with her usual morning ritual. English breakfast tea, toast with blackberry jam, and the crossword from the local paper, until the thunder came. Not from the sky. The sky was cloudless, blue, perfect. This thunder rolled on pavement, harsh, loud, mechanical. She looked up, heart skipping. The sound grew closer, a growl, no, a swarm. Maggie shuffled to the window and pulled the curtain aside. A pack of motorcycles, shiny, monstrous things, tore down her quiet suburban street like a storm without rain. They rumbled to a stop across from her house, in front of the old Barrett place, which had been empty since Mr. Barrett passed last fall. Doors slammed, boots stomped. Laughter, harsh, guttural, male, filled the air. Maggie's knuckles whitened on the windowsill. There were 7 of them, maybe more. Leather jackets, ripped jeans, shaved heads, tattoos crawling up necks. One of them, tall, thick-necked, with a beard like a Viking, pulled off his helmet and looked directly at her window. He smirked. Her tea had gone cold. For the next few days, the street was never quiet. The bikers, a gang that called themselves Razor Saints, blasted music at all hours. They drank on their porch, revved their bikes at midnight. One of them urinated in Maggie's front yard. Another left a beer bottle on her porch like it was some sort of calling card. She filed a noise complaint. Nothing happened. She called again. The police said they'd keep an eye on things. No one did. On the 5th day, Maggie stood on her porch as the Viking-looking one, the leader she suspected, passed by with a bag of groceries. He looked her way again. This time, he didn't smirk. He winked. "You need anything, Granny?" he said, voice thick like oil. "I got time to help the elderly." Her hands curled into fists. "What I need," she said clearly, "is for you and your pack of rats to leave this town." He stopped. The whole group behind him paused. "You've got spunk," he said. "I like that." Then he laughed. So did the others, as if her words had been nothing more than a punchline. That night, Maggie didn't sleep. She sat in the living room with the lights off, clutching an old photo frame in her lap. The photo inside was faded, the corners curling. A handsome young pilot in uniform grinning in the sunlight. Tommy Kane, her first and only love, lost in Europe in 1945. He'd never met his son, and now his grandson, Jack, hadn't spoken to her in 15 years. She traced Tommy's face with her finger, then set the frame down. Her other hand reached for the rotary phone on the side table. She hadn't used it in years. The button stuck a little as she dialed. It rang once, twice, then someone picked up, a man's voice, gravelly, cautious. "Yeah?" She closed her eyes, steadied her breath. "Jack." "It's Mom." Silence. "I need your help. Far away." In a small trailer in Arizona, Jack Kane stood frozen, the phone pressed to his ear. His eyes narrowed. He hadn't heard her voice since the funeral. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. "No," she said. "But I will be if you come home." Back in Maggie's house, the clock ticked softly on the wall. She hung up the phone, her hand trembling only slightly. The Razor Saints didn't know who they were dealing with. Not yet, but they would. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? In the quiet hours of dawn, before the street stirred again with the crackle of motorcycle exhaust and blaring rock music, Maggie sat in the attic, lost in another time. Dust motes floated like memories in the golden morning light. She opened an old cedar chest, worn smooth by decades of her hands, and pulled out a box marked 1944 Europe. Inside, photographs in black and white, yellowed letters, pressed flowers, a nurse's cap folded with military precision. Her trembling fingers touched each item as if it were still warm from the past. 44, Normandy, France. She was just 20 years old then. Fresh-faced, sharp-tongued, determined to make a difference. They called her Red for the bold auburn. Curls always poking from under her cap, no matter how tight she pinned them. She had served in field hospitals, stitching together young men barely older than herself. The days were filled with blood and grit, the nights with prayers and letters home, and then came Tommy Kane. He was reckless and beautiful in that death-can't-touch-me way only flyboys seem to carry. His bomber jacket was always half-zipped, and he smelled faintly of oil and peppermint gum. He flirted shamelessly with every nurse, but only really watched Maggie. They stole moments between chaos, danced under the stars to a scratched Glenn Miller record, played from a soldier's portable phonograph. He kissed her like he meant forever, and then, one day, he didn't come back. The telegram came weeks later, missing in action, presumed dead. She had cried once, just once. Then she put the photo of Tommy inside her Bible, packed away her heartbreak, and signed on for another year. She didn't know it at the time, but she was already pregnant. Back. In the present, Maggie held one of Tommy's old letters. His writing was jagged, hurried, ink smudged from the field from his fingers. Read, "If anything happens, know this. You changed me. You made me believe in something bigger than the war. I love you. Always. Tommy." Her breath hitched. She had read that letter 100 times, but it still cracked something open inside her. She had raised Jack alone. He had inherited Tommy's eyes, piercing, steel grey, full of fire. But he'd also inherited the pain of growing up without a father, and eventually without answers. She had never told him the truth about Tommy. Not even when he asked, not even when it mattered most, and that silence had cost her everything. There. Last conversation had been 10 words long. At Jack's wife's funeral, he'd looked at her, eyes hollowed by grief, and asked, "Why do you never tell me anything that matters?" She hadn't had the courage then. She might not have the time now. Outside, the sound of engines pierced the morning stillness again. The Razor Saints were waking up. The leader, the one who winked, revved his engine like it was a war cry. Maggie stood slowly, back straight despite her age. She wasn't afraid of engines, or punks, or men who thought power came from noise. She'd stood in blood-soaked tents with bombs falling outside. She'd held dying soldiers and whispered songs there. Mothers used to sing. She had survived a war, and then another one at home in silence. This was just the beginning. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. Maggie looked up, and for the first time in 15 years, there stood Jack Kane, broad-shouldered, sunburned, scarred in ways only war and heartbreak could carve. He held nothing but a duffel bag and a worn expression. They stared at each other in silence. Neither moved, neither cried, but something passed between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but a beginning. "Hi, Ma," Jack said finally. Maggie nodded once. "You came." "Of course I came." And just like that, the war for their street and their family began. Jack had only been back in his childhood home for 12 hours, and already his fists itched. He stood in the living room beside the front window, arms crossed, watching as the Razor Saints lounged on the lawn across the street, like they owned the whole damn town. One of them was shirtless, a snake tattoo curling across his chest, sipping beer at 9 a.m. Another leaned over the hood of a rusted-out Camaro, blasting music so loud it rattled the glass in Maggie's windows. "You weren't exaggerating," Jack muttered. Maggie, seated in her favorite armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, didn't look up. "They're louder on weekends. They're lucky I wasn't here sooner. Violence won't solve this." Jack turned to her, brow furrowed. "You sure about that?" Maggie's eyes, sharp even at 90, pinned him like she had when he was 8 and caught stealing candy from the corner store. "I didn't raise you to punch your way through everything, Jack. No, Ma. You raised me to fight for what's right." Later that day, Jack walked down the porch steps and made his way across the street. Every instinct told him to size them up first, observe, assess. He'd led recon teams in Afghanistan. With fewer nerves, the leader, Rhett as he soon learned, sat in a folding lawn chair like a king on a throne made of chrome and cheap beer. He looked up lazily as Jack approached. "You look like trouble," Rhett said, grinning. "Marine?" "Former," Jack replied. "Name's Jack, Margaret O'Hara's son." Rhett's eyebrows rose slightly. "Didn't know Granny had a kid." Jack didn't blink. "She does, and I hear you've been making yourselves a little too comfortable around here." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was low, mean and full of something worse than disrespect. Amusement, like Jack was an episode in a show they'd already seen 100 times. "You planning to do something about it?" Rhett asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jack stared him down, calm as a loaded gun. "Not yet. Just saying hello." He turned and walked away before Rhett could reply, because nothing rattled a man like someone who didn't flinch. That night, Jack sat at the kitchen table going through Maggie's notes. She had a whole folder, dates, times, videos from her old doorbell camera, even blurry photos of license plates. "You kept all this?" Jack asked, impressed. Maggie shrugged. "I was a nurse. Documentation saves lives, or at least sanity." "You ever take this to the police?" "Twice. They filed it somewhere between not urgent and not worth it. Small town, Jack. They don't want trouble with a biker gang." Jack's jaw tightened. "They don't know what trouble." "Looks like yet," he muttered. The next few days followed a pattern. Jack watched, listened, took mental notes. The Saints weren't just loud, they were smart, just under the line. Noise, but not past curfew. Trash on the lawn, but on their side of the street. Public drinking, but with the labels peeled off the bottles. They knew the law and danced right on the edge of it. It wasn't just about nuisance, it was intimidation. One night, Jack caught one of them walking along Maggie's fence with a flashlight, not damaging anything, just watching. Jack stepped outside, arms crossed. The biker saw him and smiled, slow and oily. "Nice night," the man said. Jack didn't answer, just stood there, and eventually the biker walked away. Inside, Maggie watched him through the window. "You planning to sleep at all while you're here?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "I'll sleep when they're gone." "You always were stubborn," says the woman who once chased off a copperhead with a broom. They both smiled, but only briefly. The next morning, they found the mailbox. Smashed. Maggie's nameplate, a brass one Jack had made for her in high school shop class, was lying in the dirt. Jack picked it up, brushed the dirt off, and stared at it. "They want me to snap," he said quietly. Maggie nodded. "That's how they win." Jack clenched his jaw. "Well," he said, slipping the nameplate into his pocket, "if they want to play games, I'll teach 'em a few they haven't seen yet." And just like that, the war officially began. Not the loud kind. The quiet, silent. The kind where every step was calculated, where silence was a weapon, where a former Marine and a 90-year-old war nurse were about to remind a gang of bullies what real grit looked like. The day started quietly, too quietly. For a full morning, the Razor Saints made no noise, no engines, no shouting, no music loud enough to rattle windows. It was off. And Maggie knew better than to trust peace like that. She sipped her tea and watched the street from behind the curtain, her hands resting on the worn fabric of the armchair. "They're planning something," she said softly. Jack stood behind, her arms folded across his chest. "How can you tell?" "Because men like that never go quiet unless they're winding up to do something worse." She was right. That afternoon, while Jack was in town picking up a motion-activated floodlight, someone slipped onto the porch. They didn't steal anything. They didn't break the lock. They just smashed the living room window. And with it, something far more valuable. When Jack got back, he saw the broken glass first. Then the sound hit him. Maggie's voice, quiet and trembling. He rushed inside. She was on her knees, trembling fingers gathering shards from the floor. And next to her, the old framed photo of Tommy, cracked straight down the center. The glass had sliced through his face like a wound that wouldn't close. Jack stopped cold. She looked up at him, cheeks damp but defiant. They didn't even bother taking anything. Just this. Jack knelt beside her. "I should have put it away when they moved in," she muttered, trying to keep her voice even. "No," he said, jaw clenched. "They wanted to hurt you. This was intentional." His hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just about noise or territory anymore. This was personal. That night, Jack didn't sleep. Instead, he sat on the front porch with a folding chair and a flashlight watching the shadows. He didn't smoke, but he held a toothpick between his teeth like his father, the way Tommy did, in the one surviving photo. Something about it grounded him. In his lap sat the broken frame carefully taped together. The picture was creased but still intact. Maggie had put it back on the mantel before she went to bed. She wouldn't want you fighting over this, Jack muttered to himself. But it wasn't about the picture anymore. It was about what it represented. The next morning, Jack took a walk. Not down Main Street, not to the diner. He went to the far side of town, past the abandoned mill, where signal towers ended and silence stretched. There, in a beat-up garage that smelled of oil and adrenaline, he found Benji. Benji still had that same crooked grin and wild hair that got them both suspended back in high school. But now he was older, wiry, and working security tech for shady folks and not-so-shady ones. Jack stepped into the dim light and simply said, "I need eyes. And maybe a little sting." Benji raised an eyebrow. "Tell me it's not drug lords." Again, Jack smirked. "Worse, biker trash, and they're bullying my mother." Benji whistled. "Well, hell, say no more." By evening, Jack had returned home with a duffel bag full of gear. Trail cameras, wireless mics, thermal drones small enough to fly under radar. Maggie watched him from the porch, one eyebrow raised. "Jack, what did you do?" "Just prepping," he said, pulling out a roll of black wire. "For what? A war?" He paused, looked her straight in the eyes. "For proof," he said, "because if the cops won't believe you, they'll damn well believe me." At dusk, Maggie found him in the backyard, halfway up a ladder, wiring a motion sensor to the edge of the roof. "You're just like your father," she said. Jack paused, glancing down. "You never talk about him." She walked over to the ladder, gazing up at him, her face calm but unreadable. "I was afraid if I said too much I'd lose what little I had left of him. But I think that silence cost me more than I ever realized." Jack looked at her, eyes softening. "It's not too late." She gave a small smile. "Then tell me what your plan is." Inside the house, he spread out the blueprint. Maps, photos, a full dossier of the Razor Saints. He'd been studying them for days, routines, routes, who was always armed, who did the talking. They're cocky, sloppy, but they're organized. Somebody's giving orders and they follow 'em. Maggie nodded. "So you're going to expose them and scare them. A little fear can make a man move faster than guilt ever could. Just don't lose yourself in it, Jack." He looked at her, and for a moment the soldier faded, the sun returning to his eyes. "I won't." That night, while the Razor Saints drank and cursed at some late-night football game blaring through busted speakers, Jack and Benji installed 2 high-res trail cams in the alley behind the house across the street. They didn't even notice. Not yet, but soon they'd learn they weren't the only predators on this street, and one broken picture frame, that was the last straw. Jack stood in the garage behind the house, staring at the laptop screen in front of him. The footage from the last 48 hours played back in grainy black and white, time-stamped and tagged. There it was. Proof. 3 members of the Razor Saints, including Rhett, stumbling drunk down the alley, tossing beer bottles against a neighbor's fence. Another one kicked a stray cat. The worst clip, Rhett relieving himself directly onto the American flag hanging outside a veteran's house 2 doors down. Jack leaned closer, jaw tight. "They don't just disrespect people," he muttered. "They disrespect everything." Benji, who was sipping an energy drink nearby, nodded. "You've got enough here to burn them in every neighborhood Facebook group in a 100-mile radius." Jack wasn't smiling. He clicked a few keys, time-stamped the worst clips, and saved them onto a flash drive labeled Truth. Then he picked up his phone. Maggie was at the kitchen table flipping through an old military yearbook when she heard Jack's voice through the back door. "Yeah, it's Jack Kane. I know it's been a while. I'm calling in that favor." A pause. "Don't. Give me that things change bull. This is my mother we're talking about." Another pause, then a quieter voice. "Yeah, her." Maggie froze. She hadn't heard that tone in his voice since his deployment. When he walked back inside, she looked at him without a word. "Who was that?" she asked finally. Jack sat down, placed the flash drive on the table. "His name's Marcus Trent, Homeland Security Liaison for Domestic Threat Assessments. He owes me big." What kind of favor are you calling in? The kind that scares bad men into running. The next morning, Jack dropped an unmarked envelope into the mailbox at City Hall. Inside were screenshots from the footage and a neatly typed list: ongoing noise violations, vandalism of veteran property, public intoxication, possible parole violations, see enclosed photos. No return address. Just a sticky note that said, "If you don't act, the media will." Then Jack made another stop in the local news station. Meanwhile, Maggie was taking a quieter step of her own. She hadn't picked up the phone to call anyone from her military past in decades, but she remembered the number like it was burned into her bones. Lillian Brooks, her best friend from the 44th Evacuation Hospital, now retired, and running a veteran women's outreach group in Illinois. "Red?" Lillian's voice came through. Older now, but still unmistakable. "Holy hell, is that really you? I need a little help," Maggie said. "Say the word." By the time the sun went down, the Razor Saints had no idea they were being watched from 3 angles. Not just by Jack or his tech, but now by a quiet army of women veterans and retired servicemen across 3 states, all connected by phone, email, and silent fury. Maggie had reactivated the old network. The same women who had stitched up soldiers under mortar fire were now watching live streams from porch cams and trail sensors, sharing screenshots in a private Facebook group titled Operation Iron Magnolia. Jack found Maggie in the living room, reviewing footage on an iPad like she was back on a field triage board. He laughed quietly. "Didn't think you even knew how to use an iPad." She didn't look up. "I didn't. Until this morning," he smiled. "You're dangerous, Ma. Always have been." That night, Jack received a call from Marcus Trent. "You weren't kidding," Marcus said. "This gang isn't just loud. They've got a few members with priors. One of them's supposed to be halfway across the country." Jack's heart jumped. "So they're in violation?" "More than that," Marcus replied. "We're flagging them for interstate activity. If you can bait them into crossing a line, vandalism, assault, even trespassing, we can justify a federal sweep." Jack looked through the window toward the gang house. "They've already crossed the line. They just don't know it yet." And just when Jack thought things couldn't twist any tighter, Maggie's front porch light flickered out. A few seconds later, the screen door creaked. Jack was on his feet instantly, sliding the old hunting rifle from above the fireplace. He eased the door open. Nothing. Until he looked down. A single playing card sat at the doorstep. The Queen of Hearts, burned around the edges, with a crude drawing of a wheelchair scribbled across her face. Jack's stomach turned. It wasn't random. It was a threat directed at her. Inside, Maggie stood tall, no fear in her eyes. "I've faced down worse than cowards with motorcycles," she said. "But this is different. They're targeting the memory of who I was, what I fought for." Jack nodded. "And they just made their biggest mistake." Yet, the sun was just beginning to rise over the rooftops of the quiet street when Jack clicked the final cam into place. It was small, disguised inside a fake birdhouse that Maggie had insisted they place near the sidewalk. "Let them think they're being clever," she'd said. "We'll be smarter." By 7 a.m., the whole block was laced with surveillance, recording every breath, every beer, every sneer that came from across the street. But Jack wasn't the only one laying bait. That morning, Maggie left the house with purpose. She wore her old veteran service jacket, the one with the faded patch and silver pins from the European theatre, and marched herself straight down to the town square. Her cane clicked rhythmically on the pavement like a drumbeat. At the park gazebo, she set up a small table with photos, letters, and a cardboard sign. "Ask me what it was like to serve my country." People came, some out of curiosity, others out of guilt, people who'd seen what the Razor Saints had been doing and done nothing. A few were just neighbors who'd forgotten what courage looked like, until it sat in front of them in orthopedic shoes and battle-earned resolve. By noon, there was a crowd. Local news showed up, and one of the photos in Maggie's collection, a snapshot of her street, with the Razor Saints drinking on their porch at 10 a.m. Rhett saw the news that night. The story ran for less than 2 minutes. Just a feel-good feature. But there he was in the background, blurry but recognizable, and right there in the foreground, Maggie, smiling, holding her folded American flag, saying, "I didn't fight overseas so bullies could win at home, Rhett." Crushed the beer can in his hand. That night, Jack came home from installing a motion sensor at the neighbor's back fence and found a surprise. Maggie had rearranged the living room, moved the couch, cleared the mantel, set up a tiny TV on a chair. Planning to redecorate mid-war?" Jack asked. She looked up and handed him a USB drive. "I want you to upload this." He plugged it into his laptop and watched. It was a video, an old interview clip from the 90s. Maggie in her 60s, seated in front of a VFW banner, talking about war, loss, and healing. Then it cut to her now, today, sitting in the same chair, same angle. Only this time she said, "You want to scare an old woman? Try surviving Normandy with nothing but gauze, a bottle of whiskey, and a prayer. Try watching boys bleed out while keeping their mothers from knowing the truth. Try loving someone who never came home. I've already lived through hell. You can't. Break someone who rebuilt herself from ashes." Jack was quiet for a long time, then he nodded. "I'll post it everywhere." At 2:37 a.m., the Razor Saints struck back. They didn't knock. They didn't break in. They just stood in the yard, all of them, lining the sidewalk outside Maggie's house, 20 feet back, silent, staring. Jack saw them from the upstairs window, grabbed his phone. Every camera was rolling. Then Rhett stepped forward and placed something on the driveway. A second playing card, the King of Spades, taped to it. A note in blocky, childlike handwriting. "He dies next." Jack's jaw clenched. He walked down the stairs, unlocked the front door, and stepped out onto the porch. The cool air cut sharp against his skin. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just said, "You have no idea who you're messing with." Rhett tilted his head. "That's the thing, soldier. I think I do." At dawn, Jack called Marcus again. "Got something for you," he said. "And it's on camera. You sure, Crystal? They just made a threat against me, against a decorated veteran. And we've got footage, audio, timestamps, faces, everything." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "Okay," Marcus said. "We're coming in, quiet, swift, and federal." Jack exhaled for the first time in hours. Then he turned to Maggie, who stood behind him, arms folded, proud as ever. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "We did." Back across the street, Rhett sat at his kitchen table, thumbing through the deck of cards they'd been using to mock their targets. He wasn't smiling anymore. He hadn't seen the van parked down the block that didn't belong, hadn't noticed the drone buzzing high above the trees, hadn't thought the old woman across the street would be the one to bring him down. He had underestimated the enemy, and soon he would pay for it. The morning air was thick with anticipation, as if the world had paused and was holding its breath. Jack stood in his driveway, staring at the black SUV parked across the street. Its windows tinted so dark, it might as well have been an omen. Across the way, Rhett and the other members of the Razor Saints were still huddled on their porch, though. Now their casual slouch had turned into something far more dangerous. Every muscle in Jack's body tensed as he watched them. Too quiet, too still. "They're waiting for something," he muttered to himself, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of the rifle he'd set down by the front door. Maggie stepped up behind him, her eyes focused on the scene across the street. The past week had been a blur of surveillance, strategy, and quiet conversations with old allies. But today it all came to a head. "They're waiting for us to move first," she said. "But they won't know what's coming." Jack gave her a sideways glance. "You ready?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the old photo frame that sat on the mantel, the one that had once been broken, now repaired. The picture of Tommy, the one that had sparked all of this. "I don't know if you ever really get ready for this kind of fight," she said softly, "but I've been through enough wars to know what happens when you don't stand up." The call came in at 10:03 a.m. Jack's phone buzzed, the screen flashing Marcus Trent, Homeland Security. "They've got a location," Marcus said, his voice calm, but with an urgency that made Jack's stomach tighten. "We're moving. Send now." The Razor Saints aren't just a street gang. They're connected to something bigger. Their operations span across state lines. This is more than just local retaliation. Jack's eyes narrowed. "What do you need from me?" "Keep doing what you've been doing. We've got eyes everywhere, but we need you to bait them. We've got one shot at this, At 10:45 a.m., the Razor Saints made their first move. Jack watched through the kitchen window as Rhett stepped off the porch, followed by two of his men. They weren't wearing their usual leather jackets today. Instead, they were dressed in plain clothes trying to blend in, but their swagger betrayed them. They were looking for a fight. Maggie stood beside Jack, watching the gang's every move. The muscles in her jaw tightened, but her eyes were steady. She had seen worse. She'd been through worse. Then, without a word, Jack reached for the old wooden box on the kitchen counter, the one he'd packed full of tools, ammo, and old memories. He checked the contents. A couple of extra mags for the rifle, the handgun, and a pair of handcuffs, but most importantly, the flash drive, the one with all the footage, the one that had everything they needed to finally bring these bastards down. It was the moment of truth. As the Razor Saints slowly moved down the sidewalk, Jack slid the flash drive into his pocket and made his way out to the front porch. "Stay. Inside," he told Maggie. "No," she said firmly, standing her ground. "Not this time. They've been trying to break me for weeks. They won't." Jack nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no choice but to trust her now. He had to play his part and make sure they knew the stakes. The gang members stopped in the middle of the street just beyond Maggie's yard. Jack watched them with a steady gaze. Rhett was the first to speak. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man," he sneered. "This street belongs to us." Jack stepped forward, his boots heavy against the pavement, his eyes locked. "On Rhett. It used to belong to my family," he said, his voice low and steady, "and I'm not letting it go, not on my watch." Rhett chuckled, clearly underestimating the situation. But Jack wasn't finished. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket and held it up so that everyone could see it. "This is your future," Jack said, his voice hardening. "Every crime you've committed, every violation, it's all documented. You can either walk away and pretend it never happened, or you can face the consequences." A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, one of the other gang members, Lenny, the youngest of the group, pulled out his phone and started recording. Jack knew then that they were either going to back down or escalate. There would be no in-between. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something. Black SUVs pulling into the street. More of them. Feds. A small convoy. The Razor Saints hadn't even noticed yet. The next few seconds happened in a blur. The feds swarmed in from every direction, moving fast and coordinated, their badges flashing as they approached the gang members. Rhett's face went pale as agents surrounded him, while the rest of the gang looked stunned. "Maggie," Jack whispered, "get inside now." But she didn't hesitate. She stood beside him, watching as the agents took control. "Marcus Trent," one of the agents called out. "We've got him. Lock it down." Jack glanced over at Marcus, who was already walking toward the group, giving Jack a quick nod. He knew what he'd just witnessed. The Razor Saints were being dismantled, piece by piece. Rhett's jaw clenched. "This isn't over," he spat. Jack shook his head. "It's over for you." With the Razor Saints cuffed and their vehicles impounded, the feds began their sweep. The footage Jack had captured, the connections Maggie had rekindled, and the careful planning they had put into motion paid off. And while the Razor Saints were carted away, Maggie stood tall, her hands trembling but not from fear. She had fought for more than just survival. She had fought for justice. As the agents cleared out, Jack turned to her. "I promised you we'd get them," he said softly. Maggie nodded, her eyes hard with something new. Relief, yes, but also an understanding that the war wasn't over. It never truly was. The streets were quieter now. The Razor Saints were gone, taken into custody, their criminal empire beginning to crumble under the weight of the law. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for weeks had loosened, but the silence that followed felt heavier than expected. Maggie sat on the front porch, the sun low in the sky, its rays casting long shadows over the pavement. She held a cup of coffee in her hands, but she wasn't really drinking it. Her eyes were focused on something beyond the horizon, as though she was looking for a storm that hadn't yet arrived. Jack stood beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze wandering down the street. He had spent most of the afternoon talking to agents and giving statements, but now he was trying to process what had just happened. They had won. The Razor Saints were off the streets. Yet the victory didn't feel as sweet as he'd imagined. It didn't feel like enough. What's next? Maggie's voice broke through the stillness, a question Jack had been avoiding since the feds left. He exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the horizon. We keep going. We make sure they stay behind bars. We make sure no one fills their place. Is that enough? Jack finally turned to her, meeting her eyes. I don't know. I thought it would be. Maggie stared back at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, her lips curled into a small smile. You've been doing this long enough to know the fight never really ends, Jack, he chuckled bitterly. I was hoping for a little peace this time. Peace isn't what we were built for, Maggie said, her voice soft but firm. You don't survive wars by hoping for peace. You survive by being ready for the next one. Jack nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. She was right. They weren't done. Not by a long shot. But just as Jack was about to say something, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. A local number. Hello? He answered, his voice cautious. A low, gravelly voice responded. Is this Jack Kane? Jack's stomach tightened. Yeah, who's asking? I'm a friend of a friend. You don't know me, but I know you. And I know what you did to the high. Praise the saints, nice work. Jack's jaw clenched. What do you want? The voice chuckled darkly. Don't get too cocky, soldier. You took down the Razor Saints. Big deal. There's a bigger game at play here, and you just made yourself a target. Jack's blood ran cold. He glanced at Maggie, who was now standing beside him, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Who is this? Jack asked, his tone low and steady. You'll find out soon enough. Just know, you haven't seen the last of me. The line went dead. Who was that? Maggie asked, her voice sharp, her gaze locked on Jack. I don't know, Jack admitted, his heart pounding in his chest. But whoever they are, they're warning me about something bigger than the Razor Saints. Maggie crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. I told you the fight never ends. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. I thought we were done. I thought we had a clean break. We didn't just fight the Razor Saints, Jack, Maggie said, her voice steady. They were just the tip of the iceberg. We've only scratched the surface of what's really going on here. The next morning, Jack went through the motions of daily life, but his mind never stopped. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of reach, something far more dangerous than the gang he'd just helped take down. The mystery caller's words echoed in his mind. You haven't seen the last of me. Jack knew what that meant. They had put a serious dent in the Razor Saints operation, but the organization they were connected to, the one that reached farther than Jack and Maggie could see, was still out there, and it was watching. As he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the case files on his laptop, his thoughts were interrupted by a loud knock on the front door. Maggie stood up, her eyes sharp. You expecting someone? No, Jack said, standing quickly. Stay here. He walked toward the door, his hand resting on the handle of the handgun tucked into his waistband. Cautiously, he opened the door to find no one standing there, but a small envelope was resting on the doorstep. No return address, just a single name scrawled across the front in bold, blocky handwriting. Red Jack bent down to pick it up, his gut tightening. The paper felt cold in his hands as he ripped it open. Inside was a single photo, a grainy shot of Maggie taken from behind, standing in front of a modest house. The message was simple. We know who you are. We know where you live. Keep playing the hero and you'll regret it. Jack's pulse raced as he looked up at Maggie, who had come to stand beside him. Her eyes flickered with recognition, but there was no fear in them, only a hardened resolve. Who's Red? Jack asked, his voice low. Maggie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the photo, studying it closely. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. It's an old nickname, one from a life I thought was behind me, the people who gave it to me. They're not just dangerous, Jack, they're the reason I walked away from everything. Jack's mind raced as the pieces began to fit together. Maggie's past was more tangled than he had imagined. Who are they? Jack asked, his voice urgent. Maggie's expression was unreadable as she handed him the photo. The Red Hand. A group I used to run with. They don't forget, Jack. and they never forgive. The days that followed felt like a weight pressing down on Jack and Maggie, suffocating them with each passing hour. The photo, the cryptic warning, the name read, they all haunted their thoughts, tainting what had once seemed like a victory. Maggie had never wanted to revisit the life she'd left behind. She had spent years trying to bury her past, to outrun the demons that had shaped her into who she was now, but the Red Hand had a way of drawing you back no matter how far you ran. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jack asked one night as he sat beside her on the couch, his voice low and uncertain. "I've seen the way you're looking at that photo. Whatever this is, it's not something you should face alone." Maggie's eyes were fixed on the photo of her standing outside her old house, the one they'd left on their doorstep. The image seemed to pull her in, like a magnet drawing her back to a life she'd tried to forget. She wasn't sure if it was fear or anger that gnawed at her, but it didn't matter. She couldn't walk away from this. "I don't have a choice," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of unresolved pain. "If they're coming after me, they're coming after everything. My past isn't just mine anymore, Jack. It's ours." He could hear the unspoken truth in her words. She wasn't just talking about the Red Hand. She was talking about the legacy of blood, a life filled with betrayal, violence, and the kind of loyalty that had nearly destroyed her. "You don't have to do this alone," Jack repeated, his voice firm. "We'll handle it together." Maggie looked up at him then, her expression unreadable. "I wish I could believe that. But the Red Hand, they don't care about anyone, not even family." The next morning, Maggie and Jack made their way to a diner at the edge of town. It was one of those places that felt like it had been frozen in time, with its faded booths and the low hum of old rock music playing softly over the speakers. They sat in a corner booth, their eyes scanning the room as they waited for their contact. "I never thought I'd be back here," Maggie said, her voice distant as she looked around the diner. "I thought I left all this behind." "You can't outrun your past forever," Jack replied, his voice quiet but knowing. "But you can face it." Before Maggie could respond, the door swung open, and a tall man with a rough, weathered face stepped inside. He scanned the room before his gaze landed on them. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and a scar running down his left cheek. The way he carried himself screamed danger. He was the kind of man who had seen things that would make most people's blood run cold. Maggie's posture stiffened as the man approached their table. Jack watched her closely, his hand moving subtly to his waistband where his gun rested. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that things were about to get a lot more complicated. "You still remember how to find me?" the man said, his voice gravelly as he slid into the booth across from Maggie. His eyes were sharp, scanning her face with an intensity that made Jack uneasy. "Ray," Maggie said with a tight nod. "I didn't expect to see you again." Ray's lips curled into a half smile. "Funny how things work out, huh? You always seem to end up back where you started." Jack kept his eyes on Ray, his instincts telling him this wasn't just a casual meeting. There was history here, dangerous history, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "What do you want, Ray?" Maggie asked, her voice steady but her hand clenched around her coffee cup. Ray chuckled darkly. "I think you already know. The Red Hand's not happy, they don't like loose ends, and they're coming for you, Maggie. For both of you." Jack's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means you're both in deep now," Ray replied. "Maggie's past was never as far gone as she thought, and now the Red Hand's making a move. They don't forget and they don't forgive." Maggie leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and regret. "I've left that life behind, Ray. I've paid my dues. I'm done." "Done?" Ray scoffed. "You don't get to be done, not when they've got their sights set on you. You think you can just walk away from the Red Hand? You think they'll just forget?" Maggie's jaw tightened. "I'm not running anymore. Tell them I'm coming for them." Ray leaned back in his seat, his eyes glinting with a mix of admiration and amusement. "That's the Maggie I remember. But be careful. The Red Hand doesn't just deal with individuals, they deal in families." That night, Jack and Maggie drove out to the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place Maggie knew well, a place where she had once made deals with people who had no regard for the law or for life itself. Jack could feel the tension in the air as they approached the building. Maggie hadn't said much during the drive, but he could see the conflict in her eyes. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a reckoning. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Jack's hand instinctively went to his sidearm. He wasn't sure who was inside, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a conversation. Maggie glanced at him, her face hard and determined. "Stay close, and don't trust anyone. This is my fight." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew Maggie better than anyone, and he knew she was prepared to do whatever it took to face her past. They walked into the darkened warehouse, the shadows creeping along the walls. The only sound was their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Then a figure stepped out from the darkness. It was Red, the man who had haunted Maggie's past, the one who had given her the nickname, the one who had been her mentor, and the one who had led her into a life she never wanted. He was older now, his face lined with age and regret, but his presence was as imposing as ever. "Maggie," Red said, his voice low and cold, "you should have stayed away. You should have stayed gone." The air in the warehouse was thick, heavy with tension. The silence was deafening as Maggie and Jack stood face to face with the man who had shaped her past, the man who had pulled her into a life she had desperately tried to leave behind. Red's presence filled the room. He stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, a figure of cold authority. His eyes, once familiar to Maggie, now seemed like those of a stranger, cold, calculating, and unrecognizable. "Maggie," he said again, his voice a gravelly whisper that seemed to echo off the walls. "I never thought I'd see the day when you'd come back here. You were always meant for more than this life, but you walked away. And now you've dragged your friend here with you." He glanced at Jack, his expression hardening. "I don't like loose ends." Jack stood by Maggie's side, his stance unwavering. "You know what happens when you mess with the wrong people," he said, his voice steady but laced with danger. "We're not here to play games." Red smiled, if it could even be called a smile, and his eyes flicked toward Maggie. "You think you can run from this, Maggie? From us, you can leave, but the Red Hand doesn't forget. It doesn't let you go. We've given you every chance to come back." Maggie's pulse quickened as she stepped forward, her voice rising in anger. "I never wanted to be part of this life, Red. I walked away for a reason. I've seen the damage it does, how it destroys everything in its path." "Destroyed?" Red chuckled, shaking his head. "You're still here, aren't you? Still alive, still breathing. It's because of us. We taught you how to survive, Maggie. How to win." "And what did I win?" Maggie spat. "A life of lies, of bloodshed. A past I couldn't escape?" Red's eyes narrowed, his hand moving slowly to a gun tucked beneath his coat. "The past doesn't just disappear, Maggie. It catches up with you, and now you've made a mistake. Coming back here, bringing this man into our world." Jack's hand twitched toward his sidearm, but Maggie caught his wrist, her eyes locking onto his. She didn't need to hear him speak to know what he was thinking. They weren't going down without a fight. "We didn't come here to beg, Red," Maggie said, her voice icy and defiant. "We came here to end this, for good." Red took a step closer, his gaze lingering on her with a mixture of affection and disdain. "You never did understand, did you, Maggie? You were family to us, but now you're just a traitor. You think you can erase that? You think you can run away from who you really are?" "I'm not who I was," Maggie said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not your family anymore. I'm not your soldier. I'm done." A flash of fury crossed Red's face, and in an instant, the tension in the room shifted. The air grew thick with the promise of violence. Jack's hand was already on the grip of his gun, ready for whatever Red would throw at them. Before Red could respond, a sharp sound echoed through the warehouse. A bullet pierced the silence, narrowly missing Maggie's shoulder. It struck the wall behind her, leaving a crater in the concrete. "Get down!" Jack shouted, pushing Maggie to the ground as gunfire erupted from the shadows. The warehouse descended into chaos. The harsh staccato of gunfire rang out, and for a moment Maggie was back in a world she thought she'd left behind, the world where bullets flew and survival was the only rule. Jack didn't hesitate. He drew his weapon and fired, taking out one of the figures that emerged from the shadows. His shots were precise, but there were too many people who had come to finish what the Red Hand started. Maggie scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. Red had disappeared into the shadows, leaving her and Jack exposed. The Red Hand wasn't just a group of criminals. They were an army, a network of people willing to do anything to protect their interests. This is it, Maggie muttered to herself, her heart pounding in her chest. The end of the line. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Not again. She grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him toward cover behind a stack of crates. Bullets zipped past them, ricocheting off the metal and concrete. But Maggie's focus never wavered. She'd come too far to die here, not after everything she had survived. "We need to get out of here," Jack said, his voice tight with urgency. "We can't take them all on." Maggie shook her head. "No, we're not running. We're ending this right here, right now." Jack looked at her, his eyes full of concern. "Maggie, you don't have to do this. Let me handle it." She turned to face him, her eyes burning with the fire of someone who had made up their mind. "This is my fight, Jack. You just have my back." He didn't argue. He simply nodded, knowing full well that Maggie wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. A few minutes later, Maggie and Jack were moving through the warehouse, taking out the Red Hand members one by one. They were a team, deadly and efficient, like two sides of the same coin. Jack's tactical skills and Maggie's knowledge of the Red Hand's operations made them unstoppable. But the real battle lay ahead. The confrontation with Red was inevitable. Maggie could feel it, her pulse quickening with every step. She had no choice now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about facing her demons and putting an end to the cycle of violence. Once and for all, finally, they reached the heart of the warehouse. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the room. And there, standing at the center of it all, was Red. "You really think you can stop this?" Red sneered, his eyes filled with contempt. "You think you're the hero in this story?" Maggie stood tall, her gun aimed at his chest. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I think I'm the one who ends it." The warehouse was a battlefield. The once quiet, abandoned space now felt alive with the chaos of gunfire, shouts, and the heavy sound of Maggie's heartbeat thumping in her ears. Every corner seemed to hold a threat, every shadow a potential enemy. But it all came down to this moment, her and Red, face to face, the past and the present, colliding in a single, final confrontation. Red stood in the center of the room, his eyes locked on Maggie. His expression was one of cold amusement, as if he were watching a child trying to play in a world far beyond their understanding. But Maggie wasn't a child anymore. She wasn't the young woman he had once trained and manipulated. She had grown and she had learned. "You never knew when to quit, did you, Maggie?" Red's voice was low, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Always thinking you could outrun what you are, what you were. You're a killer, Maggie. Always have been." She stood tall, her gun aimed directly at him. "I'm not that person anymore, and I'm not afraid of you." Red chuckled, a bitter, mocking sound that made Maggie's blood boil. "Afraid of me? No, but you should be afraid of what's about to happen." He gestured to the shadows behind him. Slowly, a dozen figures emerged from the darkness, members of the Red Hand, armed and ready. Maggie's heart clenched, but she didn't back down. This was it. She had to end this once and for all. Jack's voice cut through the tension. "We need to move, now." Maggie nodded, her mind racing. She had known this moment would come. The Red Hand was not something that could be destroyed in one battle, but she could make sure it ended here with her, with Red. "You're too late," Red sneered. "The Red Hand is everywhere, Maggie. You can't kill us all." "We don't have to," Maggie replied, her voice steady. "We just have to kill you." With that, the room erupted into action. Maggie and Jack moved in sync, their training and instincts kicking in as they took cover behind the large crates scattered around the warehouse. Gunfire rained down, but they were faster. Jack fired at one of the Red Hand members, taking him down in a single shot. Maggie moved with precision, darting from cover to cover, her own shots landing with deadly accuracy. But there were too many. Red's men were everywhere, and though Maggie and Jack were skilled, they couldn't take them all out at once. They needed a plan, and fast. "Maggie, we need to find a way to cut off their supply lines," Jack shouted, as he ducked behind a crate to reload. "We can't just keep picking them off one by one." Maggie's mind raced as she scanned the room. There were crates of explosives piled against the far wall, exactly what she needed. But getting to them wouldn't be easy. Red had anticipated every move she'd make. "Maggie, don't," Jack warned, his voice urgent. But she didn't. Listen. She had no choice. The longer they fought, the more dangerous the situation became. She had to end it. Maggie sprinted toward the crates, the sound of gunfire ringing in her ears as she darted between cover. She was nearly there when a bullet whizzed past her, grazing her shoulder. Pain shot through her body, but she gritted her teeth and pressed on. She could feel the blood beginning to stain her shirt, but it didn't matter. Not now. With a final leap, she reached the crates of explosives and yanked one out, tossing it toward Jack. "Cover me!" she shouted as she quickly started to rig the explosives. Jack was already moving, shooting with precision, keeping the Red Hand members at bay. Maggie's hands shook with adrenaline as she worked, every second feeling like an eternity. She had to get this right. One wrong move and everything would go up in flames. "Do it, Maggie," Jack yelled, his voice filled with urgency as he ducked behind a crate. Maggie placed the last wire and triggered the timer. "It's done. We have 5 minutes." The explosion would be their ticket out, but they had to move fast. The Red Hand wasn't going to just let them leave. Maggie grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "Go now," she screamed. They ran, ducking under gunfire and pushing past fallen crates as they made their way toward the back door. Behind them, Red's men were closing in, but Maggie and Jack were faster, fueled by sheer will and the knowledge that this was their last chance. As they reached the back door, Maggie turned and fired one last shot at the group of Red Hand members, chasing them. The bullet took down one, but there was no time to finish them all. They had to make it out. Jack reached the door first, yanking it open as Maggie followed. They ran into the night, their breath ragged in the cool air. Behind them, the warehouse stood as a looming silhouette, silent for a moment, before the ground beneath them shook. The explosion was deafening. It sent a shockwave of heat and debris that knocked them off their feet. Maggie and Jack were thrown to the ground, but they quickly scrambled to their feet, instinctively seeking cover. The warehouse was consumed in flames, the bright orange, light casting long shadows across the parking lot. For a moment, they both just stood there watching the fire rage, the sound of it filling the air. It was over. The Red Hand was gone. But was it? Jack turned to Maggie, his expression unreadable. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse, "but there's more coming, isn't there?" Maggie didn't respond immediately. She could feel the weight of the past pressing on her chest, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "There's always more," she said quietly, her voice steady. But not tonight. They stood in silence, watching the flames burn the remnants of Maggie's past. It was a new beginning, but it wasn't over. Not yet. The fire had burned out hours ago, leaving behind nothing but smoldering ruins and a silence that felt almost unnatural. The warehouse was gone, the Red Hand with it. But for Maggie, it felt like the world had been irrevocably changed. And though the fire had wiped out the physical remnants of her past, it hadn't erased the emotional scars. She stood on the edge of the parking lot, staring at the place where the warehouse had once stood. Her face was bruised, her body sore, but it was the deep ache in her chest that lingered. She had won. She had destroyed the Red Hand. But what did that really mean? What was left after all of this? Jack approached her cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel as he came to stand beside her. "You okay?" Maggie didn't answer at first. Instead, she took a deep breath, inhaling the cool night air. The stars above them were faint, as if even the sky was reluctant to let go of the past. "I think I'm just tired," she said quietly, her voice rough. "Tired of fighting." Jack didn't press her. He understood. They had been through hell, together, and Maggie had been carrying the weight of the Red Hand for far too long. Now that it was gone, she was free in a way, but freedom came at a cost. It always did. After a long pause, Jack spoke again. "You're not alone anymore, Maggie. You've got me. We'll figure out the next step together." Maggie turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the concern there, but also the resolve. Jack wasn't going anywhere, and for the first time, she believed him. The bond they had formed over the past few days, the trust, it wasn't something she was willing to let go of. He had her back and she had his. She nodded slowly. I know, I don't know what to do with myself now. Jack gave a small smile. Start by living. For the first time in your life, you get to choose what happens next. What does that look like for you? Maggie looked down at the ground, lost in thought. For so long she had been defined by her past, by the choices others had made for her. But now she could make her own choices. The future was a blank page, and for the first time in years she didn't feel the weight of impending doom pushing down on her. What if I don't know how? Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack stepped closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. You don't have to know right now. You've been through more than most people could ever imagine, but you've made it out the other side. You've already shown you've got the strength to fight. Now, it's time to figure out what you want for you. Maggie's chest tightened, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside her. She had spent so many years running, hiding from herself and the choices she had made. But now, for the first time, she was ready to face it all. Not as the person the Red Hand had tried to mold her into, but as Maggie, as someone who had the power to decide her own fate. The next few days were a blur of logistics. They spent hours covering their tracks, making sure the remnants of the Red Hand's operations were buried, and their own involvement remained hidden. But even as they moved from one task to the next, Maggie's mind kept returning to that one question. What? Now she and Jack found a small quiet town, a few hours' drive away from the city. It wasn't much, just a place where the world seemed to move a little slower, where the chaos of their past could fade into the background. They rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Maggie spent the first few days just trying to adjust to normal life. She woke up to the sound of birds outside the window, not the screeching of tires or the sound of gunfire. She cooked breakfast for herself, even though she wasn't used to having that kind of routine. She took long walks through the park, just to feel the sun on her skin, to remind herself what it was like to live in peace. It was difficult. She felt out of place, like she was living someone else's life. But with Jack by her side, it was easier. Slowly, the weight of her past began to feel more distant, like a memory she could choose to leave behind. But peace, as it often did for Maggie, was short-lived. One evening, as they sat together in their small living room, a knock on the door startled them both. Maggie's hand instinctively went to the gun she had kept under the couch, a reflex she hadn't shaken despite the time that had passed. "Who is it?" Jack asked, his voice low. Maggie didn't answer immediately. Her instincts told her it wasn't someone who had good news. But who could it be? They hadn't done anything to attract attention, not since they left the city. She glanced at Jack, who had his own weapon, in hand, ready for anything. The knock came again, more urgent this time. "Just stay calm," she whispered to Jack as she stood, moving quietly toward the door. She peered through the peephole. It was a man she didn't recognize, but there was something about the way he stood, the quiet confidence in his posture, that sent a chill down her spine. He was no ordinary visitor. She opened the door just enough to speak through the crack, her voice steady. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes flicked to hers, and in that moment, Maggie felt a shiver of recognition. It was the look of someone who knew exactly who she was and was ready to make her pay for it. "I think it's time we had a conversation," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "About unfinished business." Maggie's hand gripped the door handle, her heart pounding in her chest. She studied the man standing in front of her, trying to read him, trying to figure out who he was. His calm demeanor only made him more dangerous. There was a confidence about him, an air of authority that made Maggie uneasy. She knew she had to stay sharp. This was no coincidence. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. The man didn't flinch. "The question is, Maggie, who are you?" he asked, leaning slightly forward as if savoring the moment. "The woman who took down the Red Hand, or the woman who used to run with them?" Maggie's stomach dropped. The way he spoke, the way he seemed to know so much about her, it was like he'd been waiting for this moment. For a second she considered slamming the door in his face, but Something told her it wouldn't be that easy. He didn't seem like the type to walk away. "I don't know what you're talking about," Maggie replied, her voice as calm as she could make it. "You have the wrong person." A small, almost imperceptible smile played at the corner of the man's lips. "Wrong person?" he repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I think you know exactly who I am, Maggie. And I think you know exactly what this is about." Maggie's grip tightened on the door, her instinct screaming at her. She'd been running from this moment for years, the moment when her past would catch up with her. It seemed like that moment had finally arrived. The man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm here to collect what's owed," he said softly. "The red hand may be gone, but there are always debts to pay, and you, Maggie, have a debt to settle." Maggie's mind raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not part of that world anymore," she said firmly. "I left that life behind." The man's eyes darkened. "You can't just walk away, Maggie. You never could." Before Maggie could respond, Jack appeared from behind her, his own gun raised and aimed at the man. "I think you need to leave," Jack said, his voice low but filled with authority. He. Man glanced at Jack, sizing him up for a moment before he let out a laugh. "You must be Jack," he said, the mocking tone clear. "I've heard about you. You're the one who thinks he can protect her. Well, let me make something clear. You can't protect her from this. No one can." Maggie stepped in front of Jack, her hand reaching out to lower his gun. "We don't want any trouble," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Whatever you think I owe, I can't pay. I'm done with the red hand. You need to leave." The man didn't move. Instead, his eyes flicked back to Maggie, his smile widening just a little. "You don't get it, do you?" he said. "This isn't about what you want. This is about what's coming for you, what's coming for both of you." Jack moved closer, his jaw clenched in frustration. "What do you want?" he demanded. "Who sent you?" The man's eyes glinted with amusement, but his next words were deadly serious. "I don't need to answer to you, Jack. I've been sent by someone who knows exactly what you've been hiding, and they want it back." Maggie's mind raced, trying to piece together who this man could be, who could be pulling the strings from the shadows. But nothing made sense. She had severed all ties with the Red Hand, she'd destroyed their network. But the man standing in front of her, he was a reminder that some things couldn't be erased so easily. "You've been living in a fantasy world, thinking you could outrun this," the man continued, his voice growing colder. "But you can't run forever. Sooner or later the past catches up." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known there would be a price for everything she had done. But this was something different. Jack stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Enough with the cryptic talk. Who are you really working for?" The man's smile vanished and his eyes hardened. "I'm working for the one person you should have feared all along, Maggie. The one you betrayed." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The real power behind the Red Hand. The one who made all the decisions. The one who's been watching you for a long time." Maggie's stomach tightened as the man's words sank in. There was only one person who could fit that description, the one who had pulled all the strings, the mastermind behind the chaos that had torn her life apart. "He's alive?" Maggie whispered, disbelief seeping into her voice. The man's smile returned, this time with a cruel edge. "Oh yes, and he's not happy." Maggie's mind was racing as the man turned and started walking away, his footsteps echoing in the silence. She had expected a battle, a confrontation of sorts, but instead he had delivered a chilling message. The mastermind behind the Red Hand wasn't just some shadow in her past. He was back, and he was coming for her. Jack moved beside her, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "What just happened, Maggie? Who is he talking about?" Maggie swallowed hard, her throat dry. The weight of the past that she had tried so desperately to bury was suddenly overwhelming. "He's talking about Victor," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor," Jack repeated, trying to process the name. "Who is he?" Maggie's gaze hardened, her memories flashing back to the darkest parts of her life. "Victor was the one who started the Red Hand. He was the one who trained me, who controlled everything. I thought he was dead, but I was wrong. He's been watching, waiting for the right moment to make his move. Jack's face darkened. Then we need to find him first, before he finds us. Maggie nodded, her jaw clenched in determination. This time we finish it. This time we stop him. The air was thick with tension as Maggie sat at the small kitchen table, the dim light overhead casting long shadows across the room. Jack was across from her, scanning his phone for any new information on Victor, the man who had controlled her life for so long. Maggie couldn't stop her mind from racing, each thought heavier than the last. Victor. The name alone sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't just a man, he was a force, a shadow that had hung over her life for years. She had run from him, fought against him, and thought she had left him behind. But now she was being dragged back into his world. Jack looked up from his phone, meeting her gaze. "We're running out of time, Maggie. He'll be looking for us. We need to get ahead of him." Maggie nodded, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. "I know, but it's not just about getting ahead of him anymore, it's about ending it once and for all." Jack leaned forward, his face serious. "I'll follow your lead, Maggie, but I need you to be sure. This isn't going to be easy. Victor won't just let us walk in and take him down. He'll fight back, and he's got a lot of resources." Maggie's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't hesitate. "I'm sure. I've lived with him for too long. He's the reason I ended up in the Red Hand. He's the reason I've lost so much. If we don't stop him now, we'll never be free." There was a long pause, the weight of their decision pressing down on both of them. Then Jack stood, walking over to where Maggie was sitting. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that both comforted and strengthened her. "We'll do this together," Jack said, his voice firm but reassuring. "We'll get through this, just like we've gotten through everything else." Maggie looked up at him, her expression hardening with resolve. No more running, no more hiding. This ends now. Victor's return wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. He had his eyes on them, and Maggie knew there was no escape. She had trained under him once, had been his right hand, his most trusted operative. But that life was over, and now she had to confront the truth of what she had been, a weapon in the hands of a monster. The clock was ticking, and Maggie couldn't afford to waste any more time. She and Jack started planning, mapping out their next move, anticipating what Victor would do. She knew him better than anyone, and that knowledge was both a weapon and a curse. "He'll want to make an example of us," Maggie said, as they pored over the maps and intel. "He always does. He doesn't just kill, he makes people suffer. He's going to come at us with everything he's got." Jack nodded. "We're not going to make it easy for him. We've got a few tricks up our sleeves." Maggie's mind flashed back to the Red Hand's methods: psychological warfare, manipulation, intimidation. Victor had always been one step ahead, controlling people by preying on their weaknesses. But now, Maggie had something he could never take from her: the will to fight for her freedom, and the strength to protect those she cared about. As they continued to prepare, Maggie's thoughts turned to the people she had left behind: her family, her friends, those she had lost because of Victor's cruelty. She thought about her parents, how they had been taken from her when she was just a child. And then there was the other side of Victor, the side that had manipulated her, shaped her into the person she had been. That person was gone, buried deep in the past, but the scars remained. "Jack," Maggie said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "we can't do this halfway. If we're going to face him, we have to be ready to end this. No more compromises, no more second chances." Jack's gaze softened and he stepped closer. "You're not alone in this, Maggie. We're in it together. Whatever happens, we'll see it through." Maggie took a deep breath, standing up to face him. "I'm ready. It's time to end this." That night, as they left their apartment and began the drive toward the location where they suspected Victor was hiding, the air seemed to thicken with every passing mile. The feeling of inevitability hung over them like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. The quiet of the small town they had settled into felt distant now. The life they had tried to build was slipping away, replaced by the certainty of violence and retribution. As they pulled into a secluded area just outside the city, Maggie felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The moment she had feared, the moment she had known was coming. She couldn't afford to be afraid now. Stay sharp, Maggie said, her voice low and commanding. Victor has eyes everywhere. This place is probably crawling with his people. Jack nodded, pulling out a set of weapons from the trunk of the car. We'll move fast, in and out, no mistakes. Maggie checked her gear, adjusting the gun at her side. She didn't want to kill Victor. She wanted to stop him. But she knew that if it came down to it, she wouldn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. Not anymore. They moved through the shadows, staying low and quiet as they approached the building that Victor was believed to be hiding in. Maggie's senses were on high alert, her heart pounding in her chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound sent a jolt through her, reminding her of just how much was at stake. When they reached the entrance, Jack motioned for Maggie to take the lead. She pushed open the door, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. The place was empty, or so it seemed. Then a voice echoed from the darkness. Maggie. Victor's voice was calm, almost soothing, but it sent a shiver down her spine. I knew you'd come. You always were predictable. Maggie's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her gun raised and ready. This ends tonight, Victor. You don't get to control me anymore. Victor stepped into the light, his cold smile a reminder of the man who had once held her life in his hands. We'll see about that, he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. The tension in the room was palpable, a stifling weight that seemed to press against Maggie's chest with every breath. Her eyes locked onto Victor as he stood across the room, his figure just barely illuminated by the flickering lights above. The room around them was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the building settling under the weight of their confrontation. It was the calm before the storm. Victor's grin was unsettling, as if he was savoring the moment. He had always been like that, always enjoying the game, the manipulation, the control. But tonight Maggie wasn't playing by his rules. She couldn't afford to. You've grown soft, Maggie. Victor's voice slid through the air like ice. You think you can walk away from all this, but that's not how it works. People like you and me, people like us, we can't just leave the game. It's in your blood. You'll always be a part of it. Maggie's grip tightened on the gun in her hand. It felt heavier than usual, but she didn't flinch. I'm done with your game, Victor, she said, her voice steady, though every fiber of her being was alert, ready for whatever he would throw at her next. And I'm done with you. Victor laughed, a low, unsettling sound that echoed in the empty space. You think you're done? You think you can just wipe the slate clean? He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. It doesn't work that way. I've built this empire, Maggie. I've molded it, and no one leaves the Red Hand, not even you. Maggie's thoughts raced, memories of her time with the Red Hand flooding her mind. She had been part of it once, had been Victor's most trusted asset. But she had broken free, she had escaped, and now here she was face to face with the monster who had shaped her life. I'm not part of your world anymore, Maggie said, her voice firmer now. I've changed. I've seen what this life does to people, what it does to families, to friends. I'm not your puppet anymore. Victor took another slow step toward her, his eyes gleaming with a cold malice. You really think you're in control, don't you? That you can just walk away from everything? You think you're different? The sharpness in his voice sent a chill down her spine. But Maggie didn't back down. She had spent years running, hiding, waiting for this moment to come. She had spent years questioning whether she could ever be free of Victor's influence. But now she understood something she hadn't before. She wasn't running anymore. No, Maggie said, her voice now calm and sure. I'm not different, but I am stronger, and I'm not afraid of you anymore. Victor's smile faltered. For a split second, but only for a moment. Then he stepped into the light, his hands casually resting by his sides, as if he were unconcerned by the gun in Maggie's hands. If you were smarter, Maggie, he said with a sneer, you'd understand that this is your last chance. You can't win this fight. The Red Hand is bigger than you, bigger than me. You're nothing without it. Maggie felt a surge of anger course through her, but she kept it in check. She had learned to control her emotions, to not let her fear dictate her actions. She had learned that from him, the same way he had taught her to control the pain, to fight without hesitation. But now she was on the other side, and it felt good. I am something, Maggie said, her voice unwavering. I'm not your tool anymore. I'm not a pawn in your game. And I'm going to end it. Victor's eyes darkened, and for the first time Maggie saw a flicker of uncertainty behind his cold, calculating gaze. You think you're in charge here? That you can just walk in and take what's mine? You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. You never did. Before Maggie could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable growl of an engine starting up outside. She knew exactly what it was. More of Victor's men. Jack, Maggie muttered under her breath, already knowing that he'd be ready to take them on. Get ready, Maggie, Jack's voice came over the comms, smooth but urgent. You'll have company soon. I've got your back. Maggie nodded, her resolve hardening. No one else needs to die tonight, Victor. This ends now. Victor chuckled darkly. You think you can stop me? You're out of your depth. This isn't just a game anymore, it's war. The door behind them suddenly burst open and a group of armed men charged into the room, guns raised. But before they could react, Jack and his team were already moving, taking them down one by one in a blur of precision and coordination. The fight was chaotic, fast-paced, but Maggie didn't lose focus. She knew what she had to do. Victor was still standing there, his back against the wall, watching the scene unfold, as if he were above it all. Maggie didn't wait. She moved toward him, every step filled with purpose. She could feel the gun in, her hand growing heavier with each passing second, but she didn't care. This was the moment that everything would change. Victor, she said, her voice cold and hard, you don't get to control anyone anymore. Not me. Not anyone. Victor's eyes flickered to the gun in her hand, and for the first time, there was a brief flicker of fear in his eyes, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual smug demeanor. You think you've won, don't you? He sneered. You've always been weak. Always running from your past, but your past is who you are, and you'll never escape it. I'm not running anymore, Maggie said, her voice low but filled with conviction. She pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and in the chaos that followed, Maggie saw Victor fall to the ground. It was over. Maggie stood over him, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her heart still racing. The battle was won. But the war, her personal war, was far from over. She had defeated Victor, but the world he had built still lingered. The Red Hand wasn't just a name. It was a symbol of everything Maggie had fought to escape. Jack came to her side, his face grim but relieved. It's done, he said quietly. Victor's gone. Maggie didn't speak for a long moment. She stared down at Victor's lifeless body, her thoughts swirling. It was done. But at what cost? The silence that followed the battle felt deafening, a void that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Maggie stood in the middle of the room, staring at the remnants of what had been her life, the crumbling empire of the Red Hand and the lifeless body of Victor. The finality of it hit her harder than she expected. She had done what she set out to do, but the victory felt hollow. Jack's footsteps broke the silence as he walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. You did it, Maggie. You ended it. She didn't reply right away, still processing the storm of emotions inside her. Yes, she had ended Victor's reign, but that didn't erase everything that came before. The years of manipulation, the lies, the sacrifices. It all came rushing back in a wave she couldn't quite control. I thought it would feel different, Maggie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I thought once I took him down everything would fall into place. But it's not like that. Jack's grip on her shoulder tightened, offering a silent but steady comfort. It never is. You didn't just fight for your freedom, Maggie. You fought for everyone's freedom, your family, your friends, all the people he hurt along the way. But healing takes time. Maggie nodded slowly. She knew Jack was right, but the weight of her past was suffocating. She had spent so many years just surviving, fighting for the next day, the next breath, that she never really gave herself the chance to live. Now that Victor was gone, she didn't know what to do with herself. Where do we go from here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack stepped around her, his eyes scanning the room, the walls, and the broken remnants of what they had just destroyed. We go forward, Maggie. We rebuild. This may be the end of one chapter, but it's the beginning of another. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie considered the possibility of a future. A life beyond the constant threat, beyond the fear. But it was hard to see beyond the wreckage she had left in her wake. Later that night, they sat in the small, dimly lit living room of a safe house, far from the chaos they had just escaped. The outside world was still, oblivious to the storm that had passed, but Maggie and Jack both knew that the consequences of their actions wouldn't be so easily erased. The Red Hand may have been dismantled, but there were still people out there, people who would want revenge for what had happened, people who would stop at nothing to fill the void left by Victor's death. We need to make sure no one else tries to step into his shoes, Jack said, his tone serious as he poured a drink from a bottle of whiskey they had found in the kitchen. There's always someone waiting for power. Maggie took the drink from him, her fingers brushing against his as she lifted it to her lips. The burn of the alcohol slid down her throat, but it didn't offer the relief she was hoping for. Her mind kept returning to the same place, the faces of the people she had betrayed, the lives she had ruined in the name of survival. I know, she said, her voice distant. But what if we're not done? What if there's more left to fight? Jack's eyes softened, and he sat next to her, his gaze thoughtful. I know you're not just going to walk away from this. You never could. But you don't have to do it alone anymore, Maggie. You've got me, and we've got each other. For a moment, Maggie let herself believe in the possibility of peace. It wasn't just about the fight anymore, it was about living, truly living. And for the first time in years, she felt like she might actually be able to. You're right, Maggie said after a long pause, setting her drink down on the table. But there's more we need to do. We need to find out who's left, who's behind the curtain. We need to make sure this isn't just some temporary victory. Jack nodded. We'll do it together. But for tonight, let's just breathe. Let's just be. As the days passed, Maggie and Jack started working to ensure the downfall of the Red Hand was complete. They traced the remnants of Victor's network, pulling down the remaining strings and cutting off any potential threats before they could rise. But with each passing day, it became clear the world they had fought to leave behind wasn't going to disappear overnight. Maggie visited the graves of her parents, her heart heavy with the memories of their loss. She stood there for a long time, just staring at the headstones, reflecting on everything she had gone through. The anger, the pain, the hatred, it had all been part of who she was. But it didn't have to define her anymore. I'm sorry, Maggie whispered to the graves. I never thought I could be free. I never thought I could live a life that didn't involve running or hiding. But I'll make it right. I'll do better. I promise. Jack stood a few feet away, giving her the space she needed. He knew how hard this was for her. But he also knew that Maggie wasn't the same person she had been when they first met. She had changed, she had grown, and she had a future ahead of her now. They both did. A few weeks later, they stood together in a small, quiet cafe, the P, weight of their past still lingering, but no longer holding them back. The sunlight streamed in through the windows, and the world outside seemed so normal, so peaceful. Maggie glanced at Jack, who smiled softly at her as they sat down with their coffee. You ever think about what comes next? She asked, her voice calm. Jack shrugged slightly. Every day, but right now I'm just enjoying the peace. Maggie smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, genuine hope. The Vancha road ahead would still have challenges, no doubt, but for the first time she wasn't afraid to walk it. She had her freedom, she had Jack, and together they could rebuild their lives. I think I'm ready to see what's next, she said, her voice steady. And with that they finished their coffee, a new chapter beginning. Not in the shadow of Victor or the Red Hand, but in the light of a future that was theirs to shape. Maggie stood at the edge of the small town, her gaze stretching across the horizon. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape. It felt peaceful, almost surreal after everything that had happened, after all the violence, the fear, the manipulation, the constant fight for survival. This stillness felt like a dream. Looks like we made it, huh? Jack's voice broke through the quiet, warm and steady behind her. Maggie turned to face him, a small smile tugging at her lips. I'm starting to think we did. For once I'm not running. Jack stepped closer, his presence a constant comfort in the midst of all the uncertainty. They had left the chaos behind. They had taken down the remnants of Victor's empire and ensured that the Red Hand couldn't rise again. They were free. But freedom, Maggie had learned, wasn't just about escaping. It was about finding a new purpose, a new path, something they hadn't figured out just yet. I don't know if we're done yet, though, Jack said, his expression thoughtful as he surveyed the quiet town. There's still a lot of cleanup to do. There are people we helped, people who need closure. The past isn't just going to disappear. Maggie nodded, understanding what he meant. As much as she wanted to believe they could just walk away from it all, she knew that wasn't how. It worked. There were people, victims of the Red Hand, who still needed help, who still needed protection from whatever was left of Victor's shadow. And there were always new challenges, new forces rising to take the place of the old. I know, Maggie said, her voice steady. But we're not doing this alone anymore. We've got each other. And that makes all the difference. Jack smiled at that, a grin that reached his eyes. We do. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Maggie and Jack worked together, reaching out to the few allies they had left. They started rebuilding, focusing on helping those who had been caught in the crossfire of the Red Hand's rise to power. They helped dismantle what was left of the criminal network that Victor had built. But it was slow work, and there were always more threats, more people who saw an opportunity to take control of what had once been Victor's. But every time they faced a new challenge, every time they overcame another obstacle, Maggie felt herself growing stronger. There was power in knowing they were making a real difference. And more importantly, there was strength in knowing that they were building something together. One day, as they were going over plans for their next steps in their small office, Maggie sat back, staring at the blueprint for a community center they had just acquired. The idea was to create a safe place for people, whether victims of the Red Hand or anyone else who needed protection or guidance. It was an idea born from the desire to give back, to build something good out of all the destruction. Jack, leaning over the desk, pointed at the blueprint. What do you think? Do we start with the community center or try to focus on getting the local economy back on track? Maggie studied the paper, her eyes scanning the design. The idea of a community center felt right. It felt like something they could both pour their efforts into, something that would bring people together and help them heal just like they were. I think the community center is a good place to start, she said, her voice clear and confident. It's a place where people can find support, where they can begin to rebuild their lives. We can give them the tools to create a future for themselves. Jack nodded, smiling at her. You're right. It's about giving people a fresh start, and I think we can make this work. As they began discussing the logistics of the project, a sudden knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Maggie raised an eyebrow. Who is it? The door opened to reveal a man she hadn't seen in years, a face she thought she'd left behind. It was Agent Daniels, the law enforcement officer who had once tried to take down Victor and his empire. He had always been an ally of sorts, though their relationship had been complicated. Maggie, Agent Daniels said, his voice tinged with surprise. Jack. I didn't expect to see you two here. Maggie stood up slowly, surprised to see him. Agent Daniels, what brings you here? He glanced around the room, clearly taking in the changes they had made. I heard about what you did, you and Jack. Victor's dead. The Red Hand is finished. That's something we never thought we'd see. Maggie crossed her arms, her brow furrowing. It's over now. What do you want from us? Daniels hesitated, then stepped further into the room. It's about the aftermath. The people who are left behind, the ones who were involved, the ones who were part of Victor's network. They're disappearing, Maggie. And I think there's something bigger happening. Something that we need your help with. Maggie's pulse quickened, and she exchanged a glance with Jack. What are you saying? He paused for a long moment, then spoke again. I think we're dealing with something even more dangerous than the Red Hand. Something that wasn't just built on power and control, but on something darker. Something that's been hiding in the shadows all this time. Jack's eyes narrowed. You're saying there's another organization? Daniels nodded grimly. I'm saying there's something much bigger going on, and I don't think we're done yet. I need you both to help me figure it out. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. The fight with Victor was over, but it seemed that their peace was still a distant dream. Maggie leaned back in her chair, the weight of Daniel's words settling heavily in the air. They had thought the Red Hand's destruction would mark the end of their journey, that the future they were building would be free from the shadows of the past. But now that hope felt increasingly fragile. The room was silent, except for the steady tick of the clock on the wall. Jack's brow furrowed as he stared at Daniels, the gravity of the situation hanging between them. You're telling us that after everything we've been through, this fight's not over? Jack asked, his voice a low rumble. Daniels looked grim, his face darkened with the burden of the information he was carrying. That's exactly what I'm saying. We thought we were dealing with one criminal empire, but there's something far larger, more organized. It's been operating in the shadows for years, even before Victor rose to power. Maggie's heart sank as she processed the implications of what he was saying. How do you know this? She asked, her voice steady but tinged with the remnants of disbelief. Daniels took a deep breath. Because the people who were involved with the Red Hand didn't just vanish. They've been quietly moving underground, and they've been pulling strings behind the scenes. There's a larger network that was never fully exposed. Maggie exchanged a quick glance with Jack. Their fight with the Red Hand had been brutal. It had cost them so much, more than they were willing to admit. But to think that they hadn't even scratched the surface of the corruption that lay beneath. We thought we were clearing out the last of it, Jack said, his voice tight. But this is bigger, Daniels nodded. Much bigger, and it's more dangerous than anything you've faced before. These people don't operate the way Victor did. They don't care about power or control. What they care about is something much more insidious. They have resources, influence, and connections that run deep, far beyond what we thought possible. Maggie felt a chill spread through her. The idea that they could have gone to all this trouble, only to be facing something worse, it was overwhelming. So what do we do now? She asked, her voice more a whisper than a question. Daniels stepped forward, his expression serious. We need to find them. We need to track them down and figure out what their endgame is. But we're not just looking for a criminal network. We're looking for something far more covert, more methodical. Whoever these people are, they won't go down easily. Jack stood up, walking over to the map they had laid out on the table. He traced a finger along the lines, as though searching for any clue, any sign of the hidden enemy. We've dismantled Victor's empire. We've exposed the Red Hand, taken down its leaders. Why are these people still so dangerous? Daniels exhaled, clearly frustrated. Because they've been operating under the radar. They don't show their faces like Victor did. They've learned from his mistakes. They don't make headlines, they make moves in silence. Whoever they are, they're not after the same kind of power. They're after something darker. Maggie's mind raced as she processed Daniel's words. Something darker? She repeated. Like what? Daniels hesitated, looking between Maggie and Jack before speaking again. I don't know yet, but whatever it is, it's big. We need to dig deeper. We need to connect the dots. The next few days were spent diving into the investigation. Maggie and Jack worked alongside Daniels, combing through old intelligence files, speaking to contacts they had made during their time dismantling the Red Hand, but nothing seemed to lead anywhere concrete. The more they dug, the more it felt like they were chasing shadows. By the end of the week, Maggie was sitting alone in the small office, staring at the pile of reports in front of her. Her fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the desk as she thought about everything they had uncovered. Nothing felt right. The pieces weren't fitting together. It was as if they were missing something crucial, a detail, a connection they couldn't see. Jack walked in, looking worn, his face tired from the endless hours they'd been putting in. No luck today, he said, slumping into the chair across from Maggie. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. We're not getting anywhere, Jack. This feels wrong, like we're being led in circles. Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. Yeah, it's like there's a bigger plan here, a bigger hand pulling the strings. Just then, Daniels walked in with a file in his hands, his expression grim. "I think I've found something." Maggie and Jack both straightened, leaning forward in their chairs as Daniels placed the file on the desk. "This came from one of our sources, a former member of Victor's inner circle who disappeared after the Red Hand fell." Maggie's pulse quickened. "What does it say?" Daniels opened the file and slid it across the desk. "It's a list of names. Some of them are well-known figures in various industries, politicians, business owners, even military personnel. But the key thing is they've all had some form of connection to Victor or his empire." Maggie scanned the list, her eyes moving over the familiar names. These people, they were involved with Victor. But why didn't we know about them before? Daniels grimaced. Because they weren't involved in the public aspects of the Red Hand. They were the ones who provided the connections, the finances, the protection. The ones who made sure Victor's empire could continue in the shadows. These names are linked to a much larger, more clandestine operation. And they're still out there. Jack's face darkened. "What does this mean?" Daniels hesitated. "It means that the people we're dealing with are not just criminals. They're deeply embedded in society. They're playing a long game, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to stay hidden." Maggie leaned back in her chair, the weight of the realization settling in her chest. "So we've been fighting ghosts all along," Daniels nodded. "And now we need to figure out who's really pulling the strings." The air was thick with tension as Maggie, Jack, and Agent Daniels pored over the list of names. They had hoped that the Red Hand's defeat would bring some semblance of peace, but it only seemed to open a door to a new, more dangerous world. A world of shadows and power brokers who had operated behind the scenes for years, untouched by the law, and now seemingly untouchable by anyone. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in around them, a presence that they couldn't see but could feel in every move they made. She ran her fingers over the list again, but nothing about it made sense. These weren't just criminals, they were pillars of society, people in positions of power. Some names were familiar from her time in the criminal world, but others, politicians, business magnates, and military officers, were unsettlingly powerful. "What are we missing here?" she muttered under her breath, pushing the papers aside in frustration. Jack leaned over the desk, scanning the list. "It's like a who's who of the elite, people with influence. These aren't small-time players. Whoever's behind this has connections that go deeper than we could have ever imagined." Daniels stood by the window, his arms crossed, deep in thought. The soft glow of the streetlights outside barely lit his face, casting long shadows that made him look like a man who had seen too much. These people, they didn't just help Victor. They protected him. They made sure his empire didn't just survive, they made sure it thrived. The question is why? Daniel's voice was low, almost to himself. What do they stand to gain from keeping the Red Hand alive, even after Victor's dead? Maggie looked up from the table, her thoughts swirling. Maybe it wasn't just about the Red Hand, maybe it's about something bigger. Jack's eyes flicked to her. Like what? Maggie bit her lip, considering. Like the way the world works, the way power is distributed. These people didn't just provide protection. They've been controlling things from the shadows for decades. Maybe the Red Hand was just a tool to keep the rest of us in check. Daniels looked at her, his gaze sharp. So you think we're not just dealing with criminals? We're dealing with an entire system of corruption? Maggie nodded slowly. Exactly. The Red Hand wasn't an isolated operation. It was a piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle we're only starting to see. Jack stood up, pacing. But we still don't have a clear picture of what's going on, Maggie. We're missing the key to all of this. Who's pulling the strings? Who's behind all this? As they continued to dig, they uncovered more names, more influential people, more connections. But it wasn't just about the individuals anymore. It was about the structure they represented, a vast network, one that spanned across industries, governments, and even law enforcement. The more they discovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a criminal operation. It was a well-oiled machine that kept the wheels of power turning, with its fingers in every pie, from business to politics to law enforcement. But Maggie, Jack, and Daniels were starting to see a pattern. They were starting to understand that what they had been fighting wasn't just the remnants of Victor's empire. It was a system designed to keep people like them in the dark, controlled and powerless. "That's it," Maggie said suddenly, her voice sharp. "This isn't just about power, it's about control. Whoever these people are, they've been holding the reins to everything." Daniels nodded grimly. "Exactly. They've been pulling the strings behind the scenes for years, controlling everything, controlling us. The Red Hand was just one part of it, and now that they've lost that, they'll do whatever it takes to keep their system intact." Jack turned to Daniels, his face set in determination. "We have to expose them, every single one of them. No matter how deep they go, we need to bring this entire network down." Daniels' eyes darkened. "It won't be easy. They're not just going to roll over, and they won't stop until they've neutralized everyone who poses a threat to their system." The hours slipped by and the three of them worked in silence. The weight of their task seemed heavier with every passing minute. As they pored over their research, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was an unsettling sensation, the feeling of unseen eyes on the back of her neck. She shook it off, focusing instead on the task at hand. But she knew that they were only scratching the surface. There was so much more to uncover, so many more secrets to expose. "Are we getting closer?" Jack asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Maggie didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the map on the wall, tracing her finger along the various names they had connected to the network. Something wasn't adding up, and she could feel it in her gut. There was a missing link, a piece of the puzzle they hadn't yet uncovered. "We're close," she finally said, her voice steady. "But we're not there yet." Daniels walked over and stood beside her, looking at the map. "You know, I've been in law enforcement a long time, but I've never seen anything like this before. This isn't just an organized crime syndicate. This is a deeply entrenched system of corruption." Maggie glanced up at him. "And they'll stop at nothing to keep it hidden." Jack stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Then we'll have to expose it all, no matter what it costs us." Later that evening, as they reviewed their findings once again, Maggie received an encrypted message on her phone. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, her heart pounding in her chest. The message was short, and it took her a moment to process what it meant. "They know you're getting close. Watch your back." Maggie's blood ran cold. The warning was clear, and it confirmed the suspicions that had been growing in her mind. The shadowy figures behind this network were watching them, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. She looked up at Jack and Daniels, her expression hardening. "We've got a problem," she said. Daniels frowned, his voice low. "What do you mean?" Maggie held up the phone, showing them the message. "They know we're getting close. We've been marked." The city was shrouded in darkness, but the tension in the air was electric. Maggie, Jack, and Agent Daniels knew they were walking into the heart of the storm. The shadowy network they had been chasing, the one that had evaded justice for decades, had finally come for them. They were no longer just investigators, they were targets. Maggie's phone buzzed again and her stomach churned. Another encrypted message: "We know where you are. It's too late." She gripped the phone tightly and glanced at Jack and Daniels, both of whom were preparing for what was to come. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just about exposing the system anymore. It was about survival. "Do you have the backup team in place?" Maggie asked Daniels, her voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath her skin. Daniels nodded, his jaw tight. "They'll be in position, but we need to move fast. Once we get in there, there's no time for mistakes. We're not just up against one enemy. We're up against an entire system." Maggie looked out the window of their safe house. The night felt heavier, more oppressive. Somewhere out there, the enemy was lurking, watching, waiting for them to make a move. And she could feel it, the undeniable sensation that they were being hunted. "We've been chasing shadows for too long," Jack muttered, checking the weapon in his holster. "It's time to shine a light on them." Maggie nodded. "We end this tonight." The operation was set in motion. Their destination, a heavily guarded facility in the outskirts of the city, one that had been operating under the radar for years. Maggie and Jack had learned that this was where the top members of the Shadow Network had been meeting, coordinating their movements and ensuring their power remained unchallenged. They approached the facility in the dead of night, their black SUVs blending into the darkness. The air was thick with the weight of anticipation, and Maggie's heart raced with every passing second. She couldn't afford to hesitate now, not when everything they had worked for was on the line. As they reached the outer perimeter, Daniels spoke in a low voice through their earpieces. "Get in, get the intel and neutralize the threat. Don't engage unless absolutely necessary." Maggie's eyes locked with Jack's for a brief moment, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no room for error now. They had come too far. They moved quickly, their footsteps silent as they approached the facility's main entrance. The guards were trained, but they weren't expecting anyone so soon. Maggie felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins as they took down the first few guards with practiced precision. "Clear," Jack whispered, his eyes scanning the area. Maggie gave a subtle nod, and they continued deeper into the facility, moving swiftly through the dimly lit hallways. The silence was deafening as they made their way toward the central chamber, the heart of the network. The moment they entered the chamber, the door slammed shut behind them, locking them inside. Voice boomed through the speakers, smooth and calculated. "Did you really think you could stop us? You've been nothing but a nuisance, and now you've come too far." Maggie's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice immediately. It wasn't just one person. This was the leader of the network, the mastermind behind it all, the one they had been chasing from the beginning. "You've made a grave mistake," Maggie said, her voice steady, though her mind raced. "You should have stayed hidden." The lights flickered before the face of the mastermind appeared on the large screen in front of them, a figure shrouded in shadows, only his cold eyes visible, staring down at them like they were insects beneath. "His boot." "We've never been hidden," the voice said with chilling calmness. "We've been right under your nose, controlling everything from the shadows. This city, this country, everything runs on our terms. You're too late to change." "Anything?" Maggie's heart pounded. "You're wrong," she shot back, her voice firm. "You've been operating in the dark, but the truth is finally coming to light, and it ends tonight." The mastermind's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think you can stop us? You've already lost. It's too late for you." Suddenly, the room exploded with sound, alarms blaring and red lights flashing, as a dozen heavily armed guards poured into the room, surrounding them on all sides. "We'll see about that," Jack growled, pulling out his weapon and firing at the closest guard. The gunfire rang out in the confined space, and chaos erupted. Maggie ducked behind a pillar, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of the mastermind on them, watching every move they made. She knew that if they didn't act quickly, they'd be outnumbered and outgunned. But they were not alone. Daniel's backup team breached the entrance, taking down several of the guards, providing the opening Maggie and Jack needed. "Go!" Daniels shouted through the earpiece. "We've got your 6!" Maggie and Jack pushed forward, taking down the remaining guards with swift precision. The fight was intense, but they were in control. Every shot they fired, every movement they made was calculated. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for everything they believed in. Finally, they reached the central control panel. Maggie rushed to it, her hands flying over the buttons as she worked to disable the system and expose the network's operations. As the mastermind's voice echoed through the speakers, Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. "You can't do this, you'll never win." But Maggie had one final card to play. With a few quick keystrokes, she released all the encrypted data, names, transactions, and secret communications, flooding the system. It was over. The network was exposed. The mastermind's voice grew frantic. "No, you think this will stop us? You're a fool." But Maggie didn't back down. The truth always finds a way. With a final press of a button, the facility's lights went out, and the entire network was brought down in one fell swoop. The mastermind's screen flickered and died, cutting off his voice. As the dust settled and the sounds of sirens filled the air, Maggie, Jack, and Daniels stood victorious. They had brought down the shadow network. Everything they had worked for, all the sacrifices, had led to this moment. Maggie took a deep breath, her body still humming with adrenaline. "It's over," she said quietly. Jack turned to her, his expression softening. "For now, but we've made sure they can't hide anymore." Daniels stepped forward, a look of satisfaction on his face. "We did what we came here to do. They won't be a problem anymore. Maggie smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was one of relief, a relief that only came from knowing that they had exposed the truth. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Epilogue: The road ahead. In the days that followed, the exposed network crumbled. Arrests were made, and the deep-rooted corruption that had plagued the city was finally eradicated. But the road ahead wasn't easy. There were still battles to fight, still people to protect, and a world to rebuild. Maggie, Jack, and Daniels had changed the course of history. They had fought not just for justice, but for the truth, and in the end, the truth had set them free.